Hey, we should be live. So, I've chosen the new commander that I've been building around. We've done the entire card selection process, and as has been the norm for me going forward since I started changing up how I do these things, we're going to go over every single card that I've selected for him, and then we'll start doing the actual cuts with the next stream. So, I picked Norman Osborn, but I don't really care about Norman Osborn. So front face is 1 in a blue, human scientist villain, 1/1. He can't be blocked. When he deals combat damage to a player, he connives, which is you draw a card, then discard a card, and if you discard a non-land card, it puts a +1/+1 counter on him. And he also has the ability to transform, but you can just straight up cast him for this same casting cost. So the transformation has to be done at sorcery speed. The other side is a normal creature spell, so the only way you can cast him at instant speed is if you give him flash. So for one blue, black, red, you get the Green Goblin, who is a goblin human villain, 3/3, flying menace. And then you get to the really good part. So spells you cast from your graveyard cost 2 less to cast, and each non-land card in your graveyard has mayhem with a mayhem cost equal to its casting cost. So Mayhem is a variant on the Madness mechanic, but instead of going to exile from being discarded and giving you the opportunity to cast it before winding up back in your graveyard if you don't, it just goes to your graveyard and you can cast it that turn as long as it's been discarded. So, little bit of rules things. If you discard a card to Mayhem and cast it, and it winds up back in your graveyard for any reason, it got counterspelled, it resolved as a permanent, and then you sacrifice that permanent. If you haven't discarded it back into your graveyard to get it back in there, then it does not have Mayhem anymore. So, you can't just keep casting the same spell over and over again that got discarded earlier. The way the rules work is it treats it as a new object with no memory of how it originally had gotten into the graveyard from being discarded once it changed zones again. So, also of note, while Madness allows you to cast the spell immediately regardless of normal timing restrictions, Mayhem does not. You still have to follow the normal timing restrictions. So if you discard a sorcery, you have to cast it at sorcery speed unless another effect is allowing you to do it at instant speed. So that's Green Goblin, and that's what we're building around. This is going to be a very combo-oriented deck. We're going to take advantage of his cost reduction to cast a huge number of spells, ideally, in a single turn and win the game. There are actual Storm cards on the list, but we might not necessarily have to win using the actual Storm mechanic. We might be able to be Storm adjacent, where we take advantage of all of the spells that we're casting in order to trigger certain abilities. You know, when you cast a spell that has a certain quality, you also do something that will advance the game state to a winning position. So we might not necessarily storm, but we're going to be storming for all intents and purposes. So I don't know what the rest of the people in my house are doing, my beloved family, so if I have to cut this one short and we have to do it as a two-parter, I apologize, but I'll keep an ear out for that because there might suddenly be a lot of background noise that the microphone will pick up, so we might have to abandon it. So Norman has a lot of cards, too. We have a whole lot to get through. So also of note, there are a lot of cards on this list that are very expensive and on the reserve list. Some of them have substitutes in other cards, some of them do not. So if your playgroup does not allow for proxies, and I wind up using those cards, we're going to have to find the closest, for lack of a better word, equivalent. Because some things do not have a good analog. Like, Wheel of Fortune, you can get by with something like Wheel of Misfortune in this deck, and it will be fine. Reforge the Soul, not so much because of the much higher casting cost baseline. It's 5 instead of 3, so you wind up paying 3 instead of 1, which is kind of a huge cost. But something like the Wheel of Misfortune from one of the commander decks, where everybody has to bid life in order to successfully Wheel of Fortune, is probably a better substitute because of the identical casting cost. The lands that you'll notice on here, the ones that make mana, substituting for them is as easy as figuring out what lands you actually have that provide the same colors of mana. So don't worry about things like Badlands and Underground and Volcanic if you're not going to proxy and you don't own them and can't afford them. Those are not essential. If your playgroup doesn't allow proxies and they don't have access to these cards either, then you don't need them in order to maintain. Like, you don't need to overwhelm the table with the slightly better lands, and they're not that big a deal. Obviously, they always come into play untapped and don't cost you any life, so they'll allow you to do more things than some of the other lands would. But normally you're going to be able to be just fine if the rest of your playgroup also doesn't have access to them. Just take into account that because Norman is a combo deck and is very mana intensive, you might want to favor dual land alternatives that come into play untapped for a lot of his stuff. But even then, I'm still running a bunch of tap lands on my own just because I want to fix his mana better, as opposed to having the lands untapped constantly. So, to start off with, we have Basalt Monolith. So, almost every mana rock in this deck starts off at being able to produce more mana than it costs to cast. If it's discard to Green Goblin, there are a handful of them that start off at mana neutral, where they cost 3, and they produce 1, but by discarding them, they cost 1 and produce 1. So there are a handful of those on the list, but we're more focused on the ones that automatically produce more mana. We have a few other cost reduction effects in the deck also that can get those ones down to the point where they are net mana positive. But Basalt Monolith is one of the ones that is just immediately mana positive. It's functionally a Soul Ring if you discard it to Norman and then use it immediately. Later on, you'll have to pay to untap it, but we're a combo deck. We don't really care about later on. We care about winning. So there will be a whole lot of cards on the list that are like that. Excuse me. Alright, so then we have Demonic Tutor. We have multiple Demonic Tutors at the black and 1 slot that have additional costs or have additional setup that this deck should be able to easily meet. And because we're trying to be a combo deck, getting the specific tutor, like getting the specific pieces into our hand at the right time is going to be very important. Notably, I do not have, or I should not have, I know I didn't put Vampiric Tutor on. I might have had Mystical Tutor on the list because I hit Mirage way sooner than Visions going alphabetically. But I'm not planning on running any of the tutors that put the card on top. Even though we do have a ton of card draw, I am way more concerned about getting the card into hand for a lot of these effects because you want to be able to discard them to get the discount anyway. And we have a whole lot of options that function, and will function for 1 mana if we have discard outlets too. So, Mana Vault, same thing as Basalt Monolith, except it's a little harder to untap. Soul Ring becomes free. Mana Vault is also free. So we have 3 and 2 colorless mana respectively. So I have Wheel of Fortune on the list, but I'm not 100% sure if I want to run cards that allow the opponents to see more cards, because if we are currently comboing off and they're not stopping us, I'm very concerned about giving opponents a fresh hand. We do have a few cards that cut off their ability to cast spells on our turn when we're going off, so it's going to depend on whether or not I feel comfortable running cards that give the opponents cards to work with or change up their hands. Some of them are very powerful in this deck. Windfall, for example, where we might be empty-handed from discarding our cards, and so giving us a full fresh grip based on other players' hands can still work. But it's kind of the same deal as Wheel of Fortune, unless somebody has like 20 cards in their hand and no maximum hand size. So I have Bazaar Baghdad on the list. Notably, I do not consider it a land because it does not naturally produce mana, so I'm treating it as a spell. We also have the Magus on the list, so one of the best analogs for Bazaar Baghdad if you don't have this, like, I think $1,000 to $2,000 land, somewhere in that range, is already on the list. But it's just in here to be another enabler to draw a bunch of cards and discard a bunch of cards. So if we cut any of the other decent draw a handful of cards and discard a bunch of cards, then just replace Bazaar with one of those. Like, honestly, you don't need it, but again, I have access to it, so I'm going to be running it. Heracle's Recall, and there are several other cards on the list. I don't think Heracle's Recall is a single blue. I'm pretty sure it's blue and one. I'm going to fix that right now. Yeah, it should be one in blue. Returns all artifacts target player controls to owner's hand. So one of the ways that we are very likely to be comboing off here is running a bunch of 2-mana artifacts that have the ability when they enter the battlefield to draw a card and then do something else that I normally don't even care about, like, at all. There's a whole bunch of them that filter mana. There's a bunch of them that do weird things that aren't even going to come up at all. Like, there's one that can tap to crew a vehicle, and there's one that can give a creature unblockable, and if it's a vampire, they gain lifelink. And I do not care at all. I just want a 0 casting cost once it's been discarded cantrip. I want to be able to cycle my cards for 0 mana and still count as casting spells. So Heracle's Recall is here to pick up all of those artifacts so that they can be discarded again, so that I can put them all into play again and draw those cards again. Mishra's Workshop, another insanely expensive land that is unnecessary, but because we are running a lot of cheap artifacts with cantrip effects, having a land that will tap for the mana to cast those, for 3 mana towards casting those if I need it, just is that much stronger. Also, the 3 mana taps for a mana rocks, because Workshop can only tap for artifact mana, like mana to cast artifacts, that still leaves me with ways to turn that back into mana I can spend on other spells. So there are a few options for Mishra's Workshop, but it's not necessary. Again, it's kind of like Ancient Tomb at that point. If you have it and you can use up all the colorless mana consistently, you're going to run it, but if you don't have it, you don't need it. Mana Drain, as one of the few counter spells actually on the list, lets us cast our spells ahead of schedule when we use it. Belwar Stone is a 2-drop mana rock that comes into play untapped and taps for colored mana in most cases. So it's another way to... It's basically a Mox with Green Goblin. If you can discard it, it's a Mox. So all of the cards that function as Moxen at that point are on the list. A handful of them won't make it. Like, the Ironcrag didn't even make the final cut, and I'm probably cutting Fractured Power Stone, because when I ran into it, I'm like, I don't have a bunch of them on the list yet, and now that I have all of them to look at, we do not have room for all of them, so... But the ones that make colored mana are most definitely staying, so Arcane Signet and Felwar Stone make the list. Ones that come into play tap like Cold Steel Heart, no. We need the mana immediately for these things. Stone Calendar is on the list. I'm also considering Helm of Awakening. Stone Calendar is much more expensive, so it probably requires a setup turn of discarding it and casting it for 3 mana. But it makes all of my spells cost 1 less, and when I'm trying to... So I have this whole rule about cost reduction effects in my deck. I go by how many spells of the type it affects am I trying to cast in a turn cycle. And if I'm realistically only casting like 1 consistently, then it's the same as a mana rock, except it's only good for the spells that it affects. So, for example, like the medallions from Tempest. Um, if I play the blue medallion, and I don't cast a blue spell in that turn cycle, I would have been better off casting a mana rock that taps for colorless if I cast any other spell. Because I did not get any mana from Sapphire Medallion for the turn cycle. And if I cast any other spell, then I would have been better off with, like a Mind Stone or something that can do other things later on and taps for colorless. If I'm casting a single spell, it's still only one colorless off. Like, if I only cast one blue spell per turn cycle that gets discounted, then I'm not getting any more benefit than I would from having a Mind Stone in play, and later on I can sack the Mind Stone to draw a card. So the question becomes, how many of the spell type that it affects are you casting in a turn cycle? And we are trying to combo off, so every single cost reduction has the potential to be used multiple times in a single turn. So Stone Calendar affects all of my spells, but it costs 5 mana to set up, so it's normally very expensive. I'd still normally rather have Gilded Lotus, which will tap for 3 mana of one color, because it's really hard to cast like 4 or 5 spells in a turn cycle for most decks. We're storming off. I can cast as many spells as I possibly can. So Stone Calendar makes a list, but it's probably going to need a setup turn before you combo off because of how expensive it is naturally. Force of Will makes a list because it can be free, and sometimes I'm using up all of my mana. Limdul's Vault is one of the cards that, because Alliances is alphabetically way earlier on the list, made it on, because it is another demonic tutor. Like, you can just pay, I forget, I did the math one time, it's like, if you have to pay a life for every 5 cards you're looking at, then, and you've already drawn the 7 cards, and you're like 2 turns deep, so, if you already have, if your deck is down to 90 cards, and you have to look at all 90 in 5 card increments, it is 18 life? Yeah. So, if I have to spend about half my life total to look at my entire deck in order to combo kill somebody and win the game, that's perfectly fine, but since we have so many other tutors, and since this will always cost 2 mana, not 1, because we can never reduce the casting cost, I'm probably going with all of the other ones first, and this one won't make the final cut. Lion's Eye Diamond is in here because it lets you discard your entire hand and makes mana. Again, this one does not have a good analog. The Diamond-Eyed Lion, or whatever it is, from Modern Horizons, costs 2 mana to cast and has Summoning Sickness, so that does eat into its potential. You're probably just better off with other discard outlets and other mana sources. But the fact that this one is both is normally going to be worth it. So the problem with Lion's Eye Diamond is that you cannot use the mana to cast a spell that you have in your hand without shenanigans. You can't crack it for the mana, cast the spell, and discard your hand, thanks to errata on Lion's Eye Diamond, to get it back to its original intent, which is that you can't use it for a spell that is physically in your hand at the time. But if you discard your hand and Norman lets you cast them from your graveyard, then you just got 3 mana towards casting it. Also, weird side note, I don't think it comes up with anything else we have in the deck, but Lion's Eye Diamond does not tap and sacrifice like, Black Lotus does. It's just sacrifice. So if there's anything that cares about tapping your artifacts to do something else in the meantime, I don't think we have any, what's the artifact convoke? Improvise? Or anything like that. If we did, though, it does work with that, and I don't think that we do. Anyway. Oh yeah, there's Mystical Tutor. In the back of my head, I'm like, I think I put Mystical Tutor on the list, but it probably shouldn't be. So we'll get rid of that when we're cutting things. Unfulfilled Desires. So, there are not a lot of cards in Magic that let you repeatedly discard cards for no mana cost that are good in the deck. There are 2 that are very strong. There's one that lets you discard 2 cards and is decently powerful, and then the rest are basically just there to be discard outlets. Like, they don't do anything else useful. Like, we have Olivia's Dragoons and Aquamoeba on the list because I need cheap discard outlets. Like, anything that costs like 4 plus mana, like the Inner Demon Gangsters or something, or Grotesque Hybrid from Torment, did not make the list because they are expensive and they don't actually provide any useful thing. Like the Inner Demons are slightly better in that they're getting +1 power each time, but I would much rather have, like Putrid Imp, where I can discard a card and it gains flying until end of turn. And my little 1/1 for 1 now has flying until end of turn. I've discarded a card to make a Flying Men. Like, that's the best I'm getting out of the cards for discarding cards in this deck for a lot of things. So, and there is nothing that lets you discard a card to draw a card for free repeatably, because that's insane. So the closest thing we have to that is Unfulfilled Desires, which costs a mana and a life in order to draw and discard. I don't know if it's going to make it all the way to the end, because that 1 mana is a major sticking point, and you can't get around it because it's the cost to activate, not a additional cost to cast the spell. So it probably won't make it, but it is the closest thing. It is the cheapest one. Everything else costs 2 mana in order to cycle a card from your hand, or is like a thing that taps to let you draw and discard, so you have to get it into play, and then you get to activate it once, and then you have to wait a turn cycle. And so this is the only one that will let you keep discarding cards to draw cards that cost less than 2 mana to activate. So it's on the list as a consideration because of that, and only that. Helm of Awakening, this one is dangerous. Making all of your opponent's spells cheaper also allows them to get on the board faster and to do cool combos sooner. But you can cast this one for free, and if you're trying to cast a dozen spells in a single turn, having all of those spells start off at 1 less mana is huge, so I have to consider Helm of Awakening. I am a little worried about it, though. So one of the things that we have that enables the deck that lets you discard cards for no mana is Zombie Infestation. So there are also a handful of cards on the list that let you make creature tokens by casting non-creature spells in general, or artifacts specifically. So Fervor is on the list to give all of those things haste. It also will give haste to the Goblin tokens from Empty the Warrens if we decide to go that route. So if we go the token making route, we need access to multiple cards that give all of our creatures haste. And Fervor is one of the ones on the list because you can get it down to a single red mana. Firestorm lets us discard our hand to kill a whole bunch of things, and that's pretty cool when I want to discard my hand anyway. Mindstone is another free mana rock. Ancient Tomb to help us get our mana even faster. Alright, so this is one of the big ones. This is one of the most powerful discard outlets we can gain access to. Mind over Matter. It is 4 blue and 2, so getting it down is going to be a minor issue, even in the deck with all of the mana fixing that we're running, all of the dual lands and whatnot. It's still going to be a thing to get this online. Once it is, though, it is the best enabler in the entire deck. So Mind over Matter is you can discard a card from your hand to tap or untap target permanent. You can untap your lands or your mana rocks to get more mana to cast more spells while making the spells cheaper. You can make the spells with colored mana in their casting cost essentially free by floating the mana and discarding the card and untapping the mana source that you just used, and then using the mana, or, if you don't have the floating mana but you cast this, you could just untap that mana source and then tap it immediately to get the mana, and now you can cast the thing that you discarded that cost a red or a black or a blue and 2 colorless mana or 2 generic mana. It is the best enabler in the game right now for this deck. The second best is Scourge Familiar, which we'll get to soon. Volras Dungeon. So this is a weird one, and this is one of those cards that I absolutely love because nobody's going to know what it does because nobody plays this card. That's not entirely true. Somebody else has to, but almost nobody's going to know what this card is. So for 2 black and 2, it's an enchantment, and it has the ability you discard a card to have target player put a card from their hand on top of their library. Any player may pay 5 life on their turn to destroy this enchantment. So we already want to discard our hand. This allows us to discard our hand while disrupting the opponent that is most likely going to be able to stop what we're doing. The downside to it is we have to cast it on the turn that we're going to start going off. Because any player can pay 5 life to destroy this, and somebody is going to realize why they need to pay 5 life to get this thing off the table and kill it. You can't use this on a setup turn, like to get it down and then pass and go through an entire turn cycle and still have this enchantment more than once in a play group, I have to believe. Like, somebody is going to know how bad this is going to go, and somebody is going to pay 5 life to stop this thing from happening. But if ever there was a deck for this card, it's this deck. So I had to put it on the list just to see if I could get it into the deck. Then we get to a whole lot of very powerful cards that enable our deck from Urza Saga. So Attunement is a 3-mana enchantment that has the ability to return this to your hand, draw 3 cards, then discard 4. Attunement was run very heavily in Replenish decks at the time, which is a 4-mana white sorcery that returns all enchantments from your graveyard to the battlefield. So drawing 3 and discarding 4, as long as you could hang on to the Replenish, was one of the best ways to set up your graveyard shenanigans. And it still is in this deck, because if we discard Attunement, then it costs a single blue. Then we can pick up Attunement to draw 3 cards and discard 4, one of which will be the Attunement, which we can now cast for blue. So we were essentially drawing 4 cards for 1 blue mana at sorcery speed, and I love Ancestral Recall. I love Ancestral Recall when it makes my spells cheaper or free for 1 blue mana. So we have to run Attunement. I love how I was reading the card, I'm like, yeah, we should probably consider Attunement, and then as I'm thinking about it, it's like, I can discard Attunement itself to its own effect and cast it for a single blue and keep doing this for a single blue mana. And like, yeah, we should put the card that's absolutely broken in our deck. We should at least consider running it. Gamble is a demonic tutor that will make you discard a card at random, and this deck wants to discard cards. Gamble is one of those cards I sometimes have difficulty running in decks where I don't have access to graveyard effects, and I'm not planning on having a giant hand most of the time when I'm casting it. Like, I don't mind stacking the odds in favor of Gamble, or like fully rigging the game so that Gamble is never bad. I do question using it if I'm going to have like 3 cards in hand when I cast it, though. I do not like a 25% chance to lose the most important card in the current situation just to have access to it through a 1-mana sorcery. But in a deck like this where there's literally no downside, where I might be upset I didn't discard the card that I just tutored for, I'm running Gamble. Next is Ill-Gotten Gain. So this one, similar to Wheel of Fortune, is a little bit dangerous, but it's only dangerous, like, more so than it normally would be, if the problematic card is in the opponent's graveyard already. What it does is everybody discards their hand, then chooses 3 cards from their graveyard to return to their hand. So, notably for this deck, you probably want to discard your entire hand and leave that in the graveyard and pull back different cards that you can then discard later on to get the discount, while leaving all the cards you just discarded in the graveyard, with a few exceptions. You know, you can't normally play lands from the graveyard with Norman. He does not affect lands. So any lands that you discard are just staying in the graveyard, presumably. I think I have Crucible on the list just to get around that a little bit, but it's still not perfect. Um, as a means for doing that. So if you do need the mana, you might pull back lands that you discarded. But for the most part, you're going to discard your hand and leave your old hand in the graveyard, pull back new cards so that you can also discard them to get the discounts on them. But it will depend on the situation. Opposition is whenever a player casts a spell, that player discards a card. So, while this is mildly problematic for a handful of cards on this list, it is absurdly powerful. So I discard a card from my hand, I cast a spell from my graveyard, this causes me to discard another card from my hand, which is now cheaper and in my graveyard. So, ideally I'm just going to keep casting spells from the graveyard and discarding cards from my hand, even as I pick them up from the effects of the cards that I'm casting from the graveyard. So, I do not care if I cast a spell and I draw like 6 cards and discard 6 cards. That is probably very good for me. Like, I want to discard all of the cards in order to combo off more consistently. Very few cards have value in the hand on the turn that I'm going off, and oppression is very much oppressive for opponents that were not planning on discarding cards from their hand every time they cast a spell and would like to hang on to their other spells. Thank you. As this thing chonks through their card advantage. Scourge Familiar is the second best enabler in the deck. It is a 5 mana 3/2 flyer that allows you to discard a card to add a single black mana. So, regardless of the card discarded, because there are a few other cards on the list that can get you mana from discarding cards, but you have to discard very specifically lands normally in order to get that extra mana. So, with that in mind, Scourge Familiar is the second best enabler in the deck. Like, once you have it down, you are getting mana for discarding the cards to make casting those spells even easier. Windfall is on the list because I might be running some combination of Wheel of Fortune effects, and Windfall is one of the strongest ones. Yawgmoth's Will. Discarding this to gain access to all of the cards in our graveyard that weren't discarded this turn so that we can cast all of them is incredibly powerful. You do have to be careful because the turn that you activate it, all of the stuff that goes back to your graveyard will get exiled. So keep that in mind. But it gives you access to your entire graveyard again, and Norman does not care if the cards were discarded specifically to get the cost reduction. So if you cast Yawgmoth's Will, you still get the cost reduction effect, even if the stuff doesn't actually have Mayhem at the time. So he does work on flashback and things that function as flashback, and Yawgmoth's Will is the strongest version of that in the game, so giving literally every card in your graveyard flashback. From Urza's Legacy, we have Frantic Search. So draw 2, discard 2, untap 3 lands. So if you discard this card and then cast it from your graveyard, you actually go up mana. This was one of the biggest things about the free spells when they were first printed, is cards like Tolarian Academy and Gaia's Cradle that could tap for large amounts of mana by themselves. Untapping them gave you a huge mana advantage and way more than you spent to cast these things. So it was very common back then to cast these spells with the idea that you were going to make a ton of mana, and that is still true today. If we knock 2 mana off the casting cost of Frantic Search and then cast it, we actually go up 2 mana instead of down 2 mana, while putting more cards in the graveyard, having drawn and discarded them. Grim Monolith is like Basalt Monolith, or Mana Vault, except slightly cheaper than Basalt and not as mana efficient as Mana Vault, but you can pay to untap it whenever, not just during the upkeep. So if you need a setup turn and you need to get the mana back from this thing, it's a lot easier to do. Rebuild is a cycling version of Heracle's Recall. So, notably, if you pay the 2 mana to cycle it, it still costs 3 mana, but now you've gotten to draw a card off of it. Or you can just discard it to a different effect and cast it for 1. So, you get options. Thran Dynamo costs 4, taps for 3, so it nets mana. It nets mana for colorless mana. Like you have to spend 2 mana. You might have to spend 2 colored mana in order to cast it from the graveyard, but it does net you total mana. So that is still worth considering. It is probably the easiest one to cut out of all of the mana rocks on this list. Moving down to Invasion, Chromatic Star. So if Chromatic Star is free and it's 1 tap and sack to filter a mana and draw a card, it's essentially cost no mana to draw a card, as long as you had 1 mana to start with. Phyrexian Altar, we are making a ton of creature tokens with some of our effects. Ashnod's Altar might have to come back onto the list if we go that route, but being able to discard cards to make the zombie tokens to Zombie Infestation, or when we cast a spell, we make the token. Having a way to turn that token into mana, especially colored mana, to let us cast more spells to keep that storm count going is worth considering. Probe is on this list. Technically, we can get it down to blue, black, and 1 to draw 3, discard 2, and then have a player discard another 2 cards, so we can make it a draw 3, discard 4 if we wanted to. But it is also just 1 blue to draw 3, discard 2. So, also I don't think it's an instant. I feel like it's a sorcery. I'd have to double check that, because it makes players discard cards, and it's very hard to make players discard cards at instant speed. Sabo's Web. So I do have a few lands on the list that have activated abilities that aren't mana abilities. So depending on what the final build looks like, but it is a 2 mana cantripping artifact. So I have to at least consider it. Diabolic Intent requires you to sacrifice a creature. If I cut one of my demonic tutors, this is the one most likely to be cut, because I need to make sure I have token creatures running around, so this costs a single black mana in order to cast. Noxious Vapors is 2 black and 1. Each player reveals their hand, chooses 1 card of each color to keep, and discards the rest. So this can be incredibly disruptive to all of the other players, and it lets you know if it's safe to try and combo off, because you will know what cards your opponents have access to break up the combo. And you want to discard your cards anyway for value. So, and if you need to hold on to stuff, as long as it's not, a colorless spell, you can actually hang on to it. If it has a color to it, though, you can hang on to it, but the colorless spells you will have to discard, so. Cephalid Colosseum. Getting Threshold should not be a problem for this deck. So the biggest problem with this card is it effectively costs 2 mana. The 1 blue tapped and the land itself to draw 3 and discard 3. Whereas we have a bunch of other cards on the list that are draw 3, discard 2 unless you discard a card of a specific type. But it's also a land, so it's not taking up deck space. So it's worth considering for that reason. Darkwater Egg and Shadowblood Egg, if you knock the 1 mana off the casting cost, they come into play untapped. They are 2 tap and sack to filter for 2 mana of either blue-black or red-black, and you get to draw a card, so they are effectively more cantripping artifacts. They're just a little bit more hoops to jump through. Psychotog is the next step up from the 2 mana free discard outlets. It's 3 mana. But if we can discard Psychotog, it gets him back down to 2, but a lot of them, it gets it down to 1 for the same thing. But at least he gets power and toughness by discarding cards. Also, he can eat cards out of your graveyard for value if you need to do that. Zombie Infestation is our 3rd best discard outlet. Discard 2 cards to make a 2/2 zombie token. The only downside to Zombie Infestation is that if you're down to a single card in hand, you cannot discard it to the infestation. to get its cost reduced, so that's a little bit annoying, but we have so many potential discard outlets that should not be the end of the world. Aquamoeba. So this is another one of the 2-mana discard outlets I was talking about. Sorry, I'm listening to things in the background to know if I have to stop soon or not. One of the free discard outlets that is one of the cheapest enablers that we have access to. Breakthrough is fun. So it's blue and X. You always draw 4 cards, and then you discard all but X cards in your hand. So if you would like to keep cards in your hand, if you can discard Breakthrough, you can still cast it for blue and draw 4 cards, and then because Norman reduced the casting cost by 2, you can set X to 2 and still only have paid the 1 blue and get to keep 2 of the cards in your hand if you would like to, or you can just draw 4 and discard your entire hand. Both good options. Cabal Ritual is on the list because we hit threshold very easily, and 1 black mana to get you 5 black mana enables a lot of things. We also have the red one, the red and 2, add 5 mana. I think it's from Mirrodin. So we have both of the rituals that can add like 5 mana for a single mana on the list because of that. Putrid Imp costs 1 black mana and is a free discard outlet. Anger, again, I might be winning by creature tokens. So if Anger is in your graveyard and you control a mountain, creatures you control have haste. The control a mountain is just to stop players from running cards like Anger and Wonder and whatnot in their decks that don't have access to the colored mana requirements and are just discarding them to get a spell-like effect on all of their creatures. Have all the fetch lands that we can run. Tendrils of Agony is the marquee storm card that wins games. So we have it on the list. Drains an opponent for 2 life. If you have never seen Tendrils of Agony, it's 2 black and 2. Target player loses 2 life, you gain 2 life, storm. So. Chromatic Sphere is... Wait, hang on. Chromatic Sphere should not be down here. Chromatic Sphere is a reprint. We already had Chromatic Sphere. Okay, so I crossed that off the list and we dropped the list down because that one's just a typo. I accidentally put that card on the list even though it did not debut there, thinking that it was one of the other variants at the time. Alright, so get rid of the chromatics thing. Chromox, if we're running a ton of artifacts, it is actually a Mox, whereas some of the other cards are only a Mox if I can discard them first. Fabricate is a single blue to tutor our best artifact, and if we are doing an artifact-based combo, that sounds pretty good to me. Gilded Lotus, if you can discard it, costs 3 and taps for 3, and taps for 3 colored mana. Granted, it all has to be the same color, so it's not always the best for filtering, but at least it gives you access to colored mana still, so that might be a thing. Also, once it's in play, it's providing a ton of mana, and if we're discarding things to untap with Mind Over Matter is one of the best targets for it for mana production. Mass Hysteria is a single red, gives all creatures haste. So even if I can't discard it, it will still only cost a single red mana. And is in here just to give all of our tokens haste if we want to win that way. O-Stone, because I might need a way to flip the entire table over because I'm losing and get the game back on track. Sculpting Steel only costs 1 mana from the graveyard and copies anything, so it can potentially copy things that tap for mana to make it free, or things that tap for more than 1 mana to let it go up mana similar to them. But it can also copy any of the other artifacts that are enabling our stuff instead, or any of the cantripping artifacts if we need another card draw. So, just basically way too versatile with what we're doing. Seething Song, I was blanking on the red ritual's name, but 5 red mana. All of the talismans are on the list because they all become Moxes when we can discard them. Thirst for Knowledge, so I didn't just put in any of the blue and 2 Draw 3, discard 2, unless you discard a card of a specific type. I specifically picked the ones that we have a reasonable chance of discarding the card in case we needed to hold on to more than one card. But ideally, and of note, even if you want, like, if you want to discard artifacts, you can still choose to discard 2 cards and then have them both be artifacts. That is allowed. It's not like you're cheating by discarding 2 artifacts to Thirst for Knowledge if you really wanted to. That is actually in the rules if you look up Thirst for Knowledge's Oracle rulings. Excuse me. Vidalcan Archmage. Whenever we cast an artifact, we draw a card, so it doubles up on the cantrip effects. Ichor Wellspring draws us a card when it comes in, and draws us a card if it dies, and we'll see Crockland Ironwork shortly, so one of the better draw cantripping artifacts. Into the Core, one of my preferred artifact removal effects, and I think these things are going to go up a little bit in value as we start adding the Infinity Stones into Commander. Being able to exile indestructible artifacts was always my main reason for running Into the Core as one of my artifact removal spells, so it's on the list as a potential. For that reason, we will have the Black Infinity Stone on the list, and I am indeed sad I can't run the other 2 yet, because they don't exist. Darksteel Ingot, one of the better 3 mana rocks because it's indestructible, so it is more likely to stick around if opponents blow up all of our things. Crucible of Worlds is on the list in case I want to play lands from the graveyard. I don't know that it's going to make the final cut because the deck space is going to be too tight, most likely. Kark Clan Ironworks lets us sacrifice artifacts for mana, which means if we can regrow them and then discard them again, that will work out. Also, sometimes we're just going to need more mana after casting the cantripping artifacts, and being able to turn them into 2 more mana after we've gotten the value out of them is just better for us. Desperate Ritual is on the list, but this was early in the card selection because Champions of Kamigawa is so early alphabetically, so that might not make the final cut. Gifts Ungiven doesn't trigger mayhem for the cards going to the graveyard, but it does let us put the cards in the graveyard, and we do have other ways to gain access to them. Also, this is one of the first times where the deck could run Gifts Ungiven after it got unbanned, so I wanted to at least think about it. Grave Robber is one of my preferred graveyard hate cards when I'm running black. Sensei's Divining Top. So the top can be free if you can discard it, and you can mill it, or not mill, you can use it to draw cards once it's in play. So there's that. Also, as I was saying, I do believe my background noise is about to spike dramatically, so we're going to call it there. So we'll pick up with Saviors for the next part. So thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. Have a good rest of your day.